the so-called deal of the century is nothing but the liquidation of the Palestinian cause, a cause that has existed now for over 7 centuries, since 1948. In 1993, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, in the person of Yasser Arafat, signed what was called the Oslo Accords. According to the Oslo Accords, the Palestinians, and when I say Palestinians, I mean Yasser Arafat and his party, not necessarily the Palestinian people, because this is not really the choice of the Palestinians. But Yasser Arafat signed 78% of historical Palestine away by saying that I recognize these territories as being Israeli, and that the remaining 22% there would be, or he was promised, a Palestinian state. So he signed this interim agreement by which he would go back to the occupied territories in the West Bank and Gaza under certain conditions. And these conditions were supposed to stay for about 5 years. During these 5 years, they were supposed to negotiate certain conditions, certain what they call final status issues. These final status issues were supposed to have ended in 1999, yet we're over 20 years now and they haven't been settled. So what Trump and the Trump administration is trying to do is to do away with the final status issues. What are these final status issues? First was the status of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was supposed to be both Israeli and Palestinian according to the Oslo Accords. The eastern side of Jerusalem would have been declared as a Palestinian capital, while the western side would have been declared as an Israeli capital, with Palestinians having sovereignty over the holy places, both Christian and Muslim, specifically the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, and the Church of the Nativity. But the Israeli far-right groups, obviously they were against this because they were trying to gobble up the whole of Jerusalem. And to be fair, every Israeli party has declared that since 1980. So on the issue of Jerusalem, which was supposed to be negotiated, and back in 2000 when Clinton was presiding over an Israeli-Palestinian negotiation, this was the breaking point because the Israelis were demanding certain rights within the Islamic holy places, which Arafat at the time, to his credit, refused, and that's why it collapsed. So going from that position, where Palestinians would have sovereignty over the holy places, will have their capital in Jerusalem, Trump declared that Jerusalem is the capital, and by Jerusalem he meant both east and west, that this would be the eternal, so-called eternal, quote-unquote, eternal capital of Israel, and therefore Palestinians will have no rights, no sovereignty, and no recourse. So he did away with that part. The second issue is the issue of refugees or the right of return. Back in 1949, the United Nations had a resolution 194 that guaranteed the right of return to all the Palestinians who were exiled by Israelis. Today, there are about 7 million Palestinians living outside Palestine, those who were forcibly exiled outside Palestine and their descendants. They mainly live in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, but also across the world in about 80 countries. So these Palestinians have the right to go back by international law, and that right was supposed to be under negotiation. You know, how many and how they go back. However, what Trump did is that he cut off the funds to the UN agency that is supposed to cater for these Palestinians, called UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency, that has been in existence since the early 50s. He cut off, because the US used to give 25% of its budget, he cut off these budgets completely, and he's trying to shut it down. He declared that there are only 30,000 Palestinians, even far short of what the Israelis at one point said that they were willing to take about 120,000 over a dozen years or so. So that right of return, what Trump or his so-called deal of the century is trying to do is to preempt that right and those negotiations, and therefore deny the Palestinians the right to go back to their land of their ancestors, the land that they lived and for thousands of years. Yet any Jew in the world today, whether he is truly Jew or not, can simply declare that he is Jew, go to Israel and receive citizenship and all kinds of support. The third issue under the so-called final status issues, which the steal of the century is trying to do away with, was the issue of borders and sovereignty. The whole negotiation was predicated on the so-called two-state solution, one state for Israelis and one state for the Palestinians. But during these 25 plus years of negotiations, the Israelis increased the number of people living there illegally under international law, who they called settlers, but they are colonists, in colonies, so-called settlements. So the number went from about 140,000 in 93 when the Oslo Accord were signed, and today, which is almost 800,000. And they have been placed strategically so that they will not have a contiguous state. So the issue of borders became extremely murky and became untenable unless you have massive withdrawal from the Palestinian territories that were occupied in 1967. And basically what Trump says that these settlements, and his Secretary of State Pompeo said these settlements are legal, and therefore they don't have to be dismantled and the settlers don't have to be moved anywhere. Now, if that is the case, and if it stays, then obviously you cannot have a two-state solution, and there will have no sovereignty and no borders. So, in effect, you end with Palestinian cantons like South Africa. They are just recognized as people with all kinds of pressure. The Israeli right is hoping that somehow they will be either move towards maybe the border to Jordan, or at least forced to immigrate, or at least live as subservient, as not even second-class citizens, but as subjects who have no rights whatsoever. The other part of this was supposed to be the acceptance of Israel. Once you have a two-state solution, it will be the acceptance of Israel throughout the region, is what is called the normalization process. So part of also the steal of the century is try to impose some kind of acceptance of not only the state but also of the people of the region, of Israel as a state and as also an accepted member of those states who are trying to confront common threat. I think it's going to be a huge backlash against not only this plan but also the interests of Israel and the interests of the United States, and that the result is going to be not only at the regional level but also international level. And I think at the end this is going to propel people to accelerate